read a lot of sci-fi and fantasy. I've only started thinking about it really coherently and trying to fill in the gaps in my knowledge in the last 2 or 3 years when I started writing a middle grade fantasy novel myself. And I always knew that my friend Simon knew a lot about sci-fi and fantasy, but I didn't realise how much till I started talking to him about it. And Simon just knows is really immersed in older classic sci-fi and fantasy books from the 80s and 90s, and he's been kind of educating me and directing me to older stuff to read. So one of these books that Simon recently directed me to read, I believe you haven't read this since you were a teenager or in your early 20s, Simon, but I just read it in September, is a book called The Lord of Light.
I've read that since I was maybe 20, 21, 22, and I'm 40. Yeah.
Okay. So I'm just going to introduce it because I've read it more recently, but I think this is an interesting book to talk about because Simon really loved it. I was not so keen. I thought there were good things about it, but there were things I also really hated. This book was written in 1967. It's part of what is known as the psychedelic new wave of books in fantasy and sci-fi, which maybe is something Simon can tell us a bit more about. I don't know that much about 1960s psychedelic new wave books, except that I know you pointed out some old like covers that I found in a second-hand shop, and you were like, that's psychedelic new wave covers. So it's part of that. It's part of that wave of writing. Now, this book is really important because it's widely regarded as like a really, really good book. A lot of very well-regarded fantasy writers put it in their top 5 fantasy and sci-fi books of all time, including I saw George R.R. Martin, who wrote A Song of Ice and Fire, the series that Game of Thrones is based on. And it's often held up as an example of a book that does that quite rare thing in the sci-fi and fantasy genre, which is that it crosses over from being a genre-based book into being a fully fledged work of literary prowess, and its style and its writing is often held up as an example of that. So I'm going to put it down now. I hope everyone's seen it enough. I will put the name in the description anyway. So I'll just summarize what it's about. So it is set on an alien planet, an Earth-like alien planet with rings, but a similar climate to the Earth. And a couple of 100 years ago, a group of people, humans from Earth, but from a far future Earth, which has really advanced technology, arrived at this planet and settled there. They colonized it. They subdued the native population of the planet, who are these quite interesting aliens in that they're non-corporeal aliens. They're composed purely of energy. They're energy beings. So this native race have been subdued and crushed by the humans, and these humans from Earth are because they have very advanced technology, they have discovered how to, when they reach the age of 60 or so, to reincarnate themselves into new bodies, new human bodies, and therefore effectively live forever. And what they've begun, and so they've lived for hundreds and hundreds of years. And what they've done is they've withheld from both the native energy-based population of Earth, of this planet, and from the growing new human population which they're creating on the planet. They've withheld their advanced technology from them, and they've used the advanced technology that they have, like the power to fly and do weird things that seem magical. They've used it to present themselves to the other humans as gods, and they've taken on themselves the names and attempted to create some of the attributes of the Hindu pantheon of gods. So they all have names like Shiva or Shiva and Krishna and Rama. And they present themselves as being magical and godlike, when in fact they just have access to this very advanced technology that nobody else has, everybody else is kept in a sort of medieval state of ignorance in which even a toilet is regarded as really advanced technology. And they hold over the population the ability to reincarnate. So what happens is when everyone reaches the age of 60, they have to approach the gods, really respectful, pray to be allowed to be reincarnated. And they're analysed with something called a psychic probe, which deems whether the gods think they're worthy or not, usually whether or not they like the gods. And then they're reincarnated into a good body if they're found worthy. If they're not found worthy, they're reincarnated into a bad body, like an animal body, or the body of someone with like incurable cancer. Or God forbid, this is held out as being a really bad thing to happen. Sometimes they are reincarnated into the body of a middle-aged woman, like a fate worse than incurable cancer, clearly. And there is a character who's known as Sam, who's basically presented as having taken on, who's also one of the original colonizing humans, who has taken on himself the attributes of the Buddha. And Sam is short for Mahasamatman, which is one of the names of the Buddha. I hope I'm saying that correctly, but he's known as Sam. And he is a rebel against the gods. He is what is known as an accelerationist, so part of a movement of people who believe that everybody should be given access to advanced technology, who rebels against the gods and fights them in various guises, and who was also compared to Lucifer in the Christian religion, and therefore the title Lord of Light. So yeah, it's about Sam's rebellion against heaven. So that's my summary of the book. Perhaps Simon, you would like to talk first about why you feel this book is really important and why you like it.
This is the first. So this is the first of these kind of books, the Grand Life ones we've done, isn't it? And the first thing that strikes me when we do this, especially when it's a book that I haven't read for 25 years, how little you remember. Like, I remember the basic concept, and I also remember that I must have thought the prose style was okay, because I have an allergic reaction to bad prose. I find it really challenging. Just for background, I did it in English.
Yeah, the prose style is normally held up as being an example of how it's work of literature, so it's considered to be.
And I can't remember why that is, apart from the fact that actually a lot of that fiction from the 70s isn't, actually I think we might get into this later. I think some of the 1980s science fiction, I think especially fantasy, is really poorly written, actually, from a kind of stylistic perspective, and this, as I say, I don't remember being that. I think that you mentioned the kind of psychedelic new wave, and I think that's really important for the context of this novel. So the psychedelic new wave really kind of just sits as part of that kind of cultural moment of the late 60s, really, and the big proponents are people like Roger Zelazny,
is the
author of this
book. I probably should have mentioned instead of just waving his name on the cover.
And then, I mean, in the UK, not in the UK, globally, the big one is Michael Moorcock, who you're a
huge fan of, right?
Literally, when I was writing my dissertation at university, and I ended up writing it about Neil Gaiman. We probably shouldn't talk too much about Neil Gaiman at this point, but there we go.
He has been accused of some quite serious crimes, which
we're not going to. But I wrote my dissertation on magic realism, Neil Gaiman, but I very nearly wrote it on Michael Moorcock, who's a very prolific writer. He started out in pulp fiction, writing for magazines like Weird Tales, not Weird Tales, do I mean Weird Tales? Anyway, writing pulp fiction for magazines on commission, and has also...
And I remember when I found that Michael Moorcock book in the second-hand shop with a really jazzy cover and showed it to you,
Absolutely.
You said that.
Absolutely, yeah, because there's a crossover between people doing art for records and doing book covers. Again, if I'd really prepared for this, I could have given you some examples, but there's an album called Tales from the Topographic Oceans by Yes, that's the 1970s record. I'm not a map.
We can also put some examples in the description of this episode when we post it.
So the artist, and again I can't remember his name, who did the art cover up for that, also did cover up lots of books. Moorcock was literally in the band Hawkwind for a bit and toured with them. So, and of course, underlying a lot of this is the use of psychedelic drugs. So that is...
Which I would say shows in this book, but I shall come on to that.
Yeah, I'm 100%. And then, of course, as you just described, you know, that kind of Occidentalist, Orientalist approach. I mean, I suspect it's probably challenging if I were to read it now from an Orientalist perspective.
Yeah, I mean, this was one of the problems I had with the book. I'm not to interrupt you, and I'm going to let you carry on, but just it's only really it's not my main quibble with the book, but I feel we have to flag with this book that there is a major cultural appropriation going on here, which would not be considered appropriate today. You know, a white American guy who I don't think has really deep immersed knowledge of Indian and Hindu culture, appropriating that culture for his purposes. And also I would say that probably, I would imagine almost certainly to religious Hindus, the depictions of some of the gods in this book are deeply offensive. So I think we just need to flag that. It was written 60 years ago,
and
so
I think it's important in the context to say that by that rationale, then we shouldn't be listening to the Beatles either, because the appropriation is a cultural appropriation for the 1960s, and this is the manifestation of that, as opposed to an isolated incident. And again,
that is an absolutely fair point. I think just for like some younger
to understand that.
Everyone, I mean, this is like in the 60s, everyone was discovering India. Right, you know, and discovering Indian culture. And there was part of the counterculture left-wing atmosphere at the time was to be very, very keen on Hindu, Indian, and also Islamic culture. There was some prominent, like Cat Stevens, who was a big singer-songwriter at the time, converted to Islam. You know, it was, so from the point of view of the artists in this period, it was a very positive thing. We might not consider it to be appropriate now, but they weren't like, probably evil.
Yeah, I mean, if anybody's interested, they should read Edward Said's Orientalism, which is a key text about the upbringing of anybody who's not white, European, American, you know, the kind of somebody who's not Occidental would put that in context. So really, I think it's historically speaking, from a kind of English literature perspective, it's a really typical text in that respect, because it you know, it feels like it could be a record to me, from my memory of it. So that's what I'm going to say about it. Apart from also, I seem to remember that there's this kind of perpetual cycle of conflict, which is picked up by other writers. Michael Moorcock explores this idea a lot, and it seems to be a really important idea that is disseminated principally by Michael Moorcock in a much wider form, but is kind of picked up later by later writers. This idea of a kind of cyclical, ongoing warfare that is impossible to break.
Yeah, there's a really interesting structure to the book whereby you start off, you know, it's not a linear narrative. It starts after Sam has rebelled against heaven and been banished into a non-reincarnation kind of intermediary place, and then it backtracks and shows how it happened, and then it goes forward. So it very much ties into that. It's really interesting. Do you want to hear what I thought about it, or do you have more thoughts?
I've nothing else to say. I've just given you the context, so I literally can't.
Okay, well, that context is really helpful, and I'm glad we talked about the cultural appropriation thing and put it in context as well. I mean, I think I love the concept, and I love the idea, which we touched on in our last chat. It is basically based on an idea that was put forward by Arthur C. Clarke, who's one of the great early 20th century sci-fi writers. He said any technology that is sufficiently advanced will appear to people as magical, and it's kind of a book about that. So I love the concept. The concept as I laid it out in my sort of introduction, I love, apart from the cultural appropriation, which obviously is not appropriate. But what I didn't like was the style. It's written in this kind of pastiche of key Indian texts Indian religious texts like the Bhagavad Gita and the Mahabharata, and it's very, a load of it is like, then Shiva went down and said forth to Vishnu, bring forth thy chariot and thy thunderbirds, for we must seek out Kali the destroyer. And there's so much of this. It felt like the interesting things of the plot got lost in it, and the characters didn't come across strongly in it in lots of places. I felt the strongest bit was chapter 3, where Sam goes down to the underworld and frees the demons, the energy being. I thought that was a really strong chapter. And chapter 4, where he got a disciple. Those were strong chapters, but a lot of it I felt like I was just wading through. And then Kali the destroyer called upon her chariot. It just felt, and I just felt like I can see why people really liked it in the 60s. I can see people reading it in the 60s and going, oh man, far out. This blows my mind. Yeah, this one. And they're taking loads of drugs and things and going like, this is far out. This is way cool, or whatever people said in the 60s. But to me, it just felt really, really tedious. I just wanted more plot. I wanted more character. I wanted a load less Hindu philosophy pastiche. But then I can see from what you've been talking about that Roger Zelazny was obviously really into that. He wanted to do that, and from his perspective, it was like a homage to Indian philosophy. So, but I found it deeply annoying, and actually I had problems finishing the book. So I feel like it's not in my top 5 fantasy works of all time. That's what I can say.
The great thing about this is that's made me want to go back to it. It's in a box in actually not in my loft, in my ex-partner's loft. So
go and get
easily
your books back from your ex-partner's loft. It's time. This has been going on for years.
Thousands of books, and
put your shelves up and go get them.
So yeah, but that's it. I suppose that's the interesting thing about doing this. If you're talking about a book you read that I point you towards that I only half remember, and the moments of surprise, because that surprises me that I would have enjoyed that.
Yeah, but probably you were as a really young person or a teenager, you were probably in that going, oh my god, far out, this is amazing.
I don't think so, because I read this post-university, so I would have been. I read it.
You had your critical facilities in place, faculties in place.
I had that in place. I mean, I had it in place before I went to do it.
I'm sure you did. I'm sure you were very early developer.
I've got a low tolerance for that, so that really surprises me. It might have been that the kind of structural innovation of it, which I do remember, powered me along with the kind of thought experiment of it, And again, the context of reading it in the early 21st century, so 2001, let's say, or probably earlier than that, 2000, would be the actual cultural appropriation wasn't really a conversation then properly. So I may not have been.
I
may not have had that strong reaction that I might do now to it. So I should go and revisit it really and see what I think.
Go and revisit it. Just read a few pages. Like I say, my main problem, it wasn't the cultural appropriation. It was just the
prose
style. I was just really struggling with it. So just read a few pages and see how you get on with it. There's also like there's some queer phobia in it, which may I feel like with older fantasy books, and by older I pretty much mean anything that was written before 2010. Like I feel that all I do is issue content warnings with it.
I mean, I think there's a lot of. I mean, again, we could talk about. That's a conversation for a different book chat, but.
It's a really big conversation, but just to rate, I mean, my top line thought on it is that I feel that I think that writing sci-fi and fantasy is a particularly exposing thing of the writer's views. Of course, writing any book exposes the writer's views, but because fantasy and sci-fi involves such a high degree of world building, if you're building a world from scratch, people can instantly see what you think about people of colour, what you think about queer people. Are they or are they not? Does your fantasy of a fantasy world include enslaved people, for example? It's like a very exposing thing to do. So, but that's my top line thought on it. But I think it's a bigger. How are we doing for time? I know you've got to go.
We're doing all right. Quarter past.
We're doing all right. wanted to. I think that we should have a whole conversation about why fantasy is such a politically exposing. But for me, it really is.
And that's one of the reasons.
No, tell me what you think.
I like Michael Moorcock, because he's so progressive, actually, in many respects, and that's why he's like.
Tell us, give our listeners a little, like, who Michael Moorcock was when he was writing
now.
What
he's
he
just
wrote.
Published.
Is he?
Yeah, he's.
My God, he's very prolific.
I think probably mid-80s. He lives in Texas these days. He's just written. I can't remember what it was called. I mean, he won the Whitbread Prize for Mother London, and he really does oscillate between. He doesn't oscillate really. The early career is Pulp Fiction. He's most famous for the Eternal Champion series, which is.
So when did he start writing? It was in the 60s or
50s, I think, early 60s. Yeah, and he wrote Conan stories, I think, initially.
Conan the Barbarian.
I think so. Again, I'm riffing. I could be wrong, but the whole sequence of the Eternal Champion is many, 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 many books. And they've just been republished over the past 10, 15 years. I never say it. Dorian, is that right? Have I pronounced that right?
I do not know how you pronounce Galantis. I've only seen it written on covers.
By them.
Written on this cover.
Collected editions. And the idea is that there is, as we were saying earlier about Lord of Light, there is a character who is this spirit who is trapped in this eternal cycle of conflict, and is manifested in various bodies, mainly male, but not always. The main series books is male, which I think is reflective of the time, but not always. He also wrote a series of books that are kind of pastiche, kind of spy novels that kind of take apart spy novels, and they kind of collide with the Eternal Champion as well. So there's lots of representation. He's very good. He's a big fan of Andrea Dworkin, which is interesting. Kind of early, I think.
Oh, that's interesting. So I've only read 2 of his books. I've read the first 2. They're the Hawkmoon books. Yeah, but what I find really interesting about him that you've told me about is this idea of the multiverse, of this character who's called Hawkmoon in the series that I read, Eternal Champion in some of the other series, coming back in different alternate universes. So it's effectively the same character, but he's in different world building situations and different alternate realities in different series.
Whilst it's often largely manifests in a male character.
Right. So
and interestingly, the most really famous character is Elric of Melniboné. He's a really iconic character who carries a sword called Stormbringer, and the Stormbringer you've got a demon inside it, and is Elric is the architect of his own destruction. There are also the gods of law and chaos that are very much part of that. And Elric of Melniboné they've been trying to bring it to the big screen for decades, and it is. Arguably one of the most iconic characters of all time. There wouldn't be Doctor Who as it exists without Moorcock's multiverse, and there certainly wouldn't be the Marvel multiverse. The concept is his, really. And the interesting thing is that I remember reading early on. Is it called Phoenix and Obsidian? I can't remember. There are a series of books called The Eternal Champion, and John Dakar, who is a 20th century male, is sucked into an alternate reality and discovers that he is that reality's manifestation of the Eternal Champion. He's a black American, and that is groundbreaking, I think.
What year was that?
1971, 1972, something like that. So in terms of what high heroic fantasy, that's a groundbreaking thing. And
it's kind of like a superhero myth in which people, it's reminding me of Spider-Man Into the Multiverse.
Well, it's
we get these different and diverse.
And they also do meet each other. Like there's the Vanishing Tower where
they do in Spider-Man Into the Multiverse as well. All the Spider-Men meet each other in different realities.
Spider-Man Far From Home. Yeah, Spider-Man Far From Home. Yeah, but that again, that wouldn't exist without this.
Well, this is great. I'm going to read more Michael Moorcock. Well, I'm going to finish the Hawkwind series. There's 2 more books in it.
Hawkwind's interesting because again, it's
Hawkwind. Sorry, I'll put it in the chat.
Hawkmoon.
Hawkmoon. Oh, I said it right the first time. Hawkmoon.
And we'll talk more about Moorcock at later dates, because there are things like the Colonel Pyat sequence, and then which are not part of the Eternal Champion, but a bit like Stephen King, actually. A lot of it's interconnected. You know, this kind of very vast body of work that is a classic.
Yeah, and we need to talk about Stephen King's The Dark Tower series. When I've read a bit more, I've read 3 books out of 8, and that is an attempt to create a fantasy world which explains explains all of Stephen King's books, which creates a book all his. So I'm really enjoying.
Essentially, the reason I mentioned earlier that I was thinking about doing my dissertation on Michael Moorcock, and I ended up doing it on Neil Gaiman and magic realism, is that interestingly, and this is another conversation at a different time, I do think science fiction and fantasy and weird fiction is the kind of the trailblazer of post-modernist fiction, because these writers are creating works that are in dialogue with themselves, and that's
really
a really big thing.
I find that really interesting, because I often find this generally with sci-fi and fantasy works, that especially in fantasy world building and in sci-fi as well, I often feel that writers are not creating their world building from scratch. They're drawing on and building on worlds and referencing worlds that other people have created.